My name is Bomis Verer, and this happened to me on November 24th, 2007. Well, what do you know? Any day in paradise, or at least what passes for paradise here in the deep south, starts off with a toss of peanuts at the squirrel clinging to the window screen, a dumb grin on its furry face. Nature's little beggar, I muttered, lighting a cigarette. The rain hammered against the tin roof, a steady drumbeat against the quiet morning. Then, a shrill ring of the phone sliced through the air. I snatched it up. Vere residence, Bomis speaking. Mr. Vere? A woman's voice? Lipped an official. This is Deputy Brenson from the Marine County Sheriff's Department. We received a call regarding a situation at your property. Situation? A frown, glancing out the window at the rain-soaked fields. What kind of situation? We've been informed of a possible incident involving one of your tenant farm. I let out a low whistle. Tenant farmers? You mean old man Millerson? That old codger's been dead for years. We'll need you to come down and confirm, sir. The drive to Millerson's place was a slog through mud and rain. The old farmhouse stood hunched at the end of a long dirt track, its windows dark and vacant. Deputy Brenson, a young woman with a face like a slapped trout, met me by the porch and pointed toward the barn. The call came from there, she said. An anonymous tip said there was a disturbance. The barn door creaked open, revealing a scene straight out of a slaughterhouse. A man lay sprawled on the hay-strewn floor, his body twisted at an impossible angle, his face a mask of terror contorted in a silent scream. Blood pooled around him, turning the hay a sickening crimson. The stench of death and something else, something metallic and acrid, hung heavy in the air. Deputy Brenson covered her mouth with her hand, her face pale. Jesus, whispered. I crouched beside the body. The dead man's vacant eyes stared up at me. It wasn't old man Millerson. This man was younger, his clothes torn and muddied. There were strange marks on his neck, deep punctures surrounded by bruised, swollen flesh. Animal attack? Brenson asked, her voice shaky. I shook my head. Whatever did this, it wasn't no animal I've ever seen. Days turned into weeks, and the investigation into the farmer's death hit a wall. Coroner's report was inconclusive, listing the cause of death as exsanguination due to unknown trauma. Wild animal attacks, cult ritual, even a deranged serial killer were all tossed around, each theory as unlikely as the next. The dead man remained unidentified, a John Doe with no past and a gruesome end. Life went on, or at least it tried to. The incident at the barn cast a long shadow. Whispers followed me like a stray dog. I spent my days working the fields, the silence broken only by the wind and the distant cries of cows. One evening, as dusk settled over the farm, I decided to take a walk. The air was thick with the scent of pine and damp earth. The woods bordering my property had always held a strange allure for me, a sense of mystery that drew me in. I followed a narrow trail deeper into the woods, the trees closing in around me, like a green tunnel. A rustling in the undergrowth caught my attention. I stopped, listening, my hand instinctively reaching for the hunting knife at my belt. The rustling grew louder, closer. A low growl sent a shiver down my spine. Suddenly, it burst from the bushes, a creature unlike anything I had ever seen. It was large, easily the size of a bear, but leaner, more agile. Skin was a patchwork of dark matted fur and leathery scales. Its head was elongated, the snout filled with rows of sharp teeth. Eyes, I couldn't describe them. They burned with an unnatural intelligence. Cold, predatory gleam. I froze, my mind struggling to comprehend what I was seeing. The creature let out a guttural snarl, its lips pulling back to reveal its teeth. It lunged, its claws slashing at me. I threw myself to the side, narrowly avoiding its razor-sharp talons. Adrenaline surged through me. I scrambled to my feet, my knife gripped tight. Creature circled me, eyes never leaving mine. Moved with an eerie grace, its powerful muscles rippling beneath it. I knew I couldn't outrun it. My only chance was to fight. I lunged forward, slashing at the creature with my knife. The blade connected with its shoulder, drawing a spray of blood. It let out a roar of pain and fury, its eyes blazing with hatred. We battled in the fading light, forest floor becoming a battlefield of blood and torn earth. Creature was fast and powerful, but I was driven by a primal urge to survive. I dodged its attacks, my knife finding its mark, again and again. Finally, with a desperate lunge, I managed to plunge the knife deep into its chest. It let out a strangled cry, body convulsing, then collapsed, its eyes glazing over in death. I stood there panting, my body covered in wounds, clothes soaked in blood, my own and theirs. Creature lay still at my feet, grotesque form illuminated by the pale moonlight. It was over, or so I thought. Days later, news broke of another attack, this time in a neighboring county. A hiker was found dead in the woods, his body bearing the same gruesome marks as the farmer. Then another and another. The killing spread like a plague, each victim a grim testament to the creature's savagery. I knew I had to do something. The creature I had killed was not alone. There were more of them out there, lurking in the shadows, waiting to strike. I contacted the authorities, but my story was met with skepticism and disbelief. They dismissed it as the ramblings of a traumatized man, desperate attempt to make sense of the unexplainable. But I knew the truth, and I knew that I was the only one. It stopped. I spent the next few months preparing, honing my skills, gathering weapons and supplies. I transformed my farm into a fortress, bulwark against the darkness that threatened to engulf the world. And then, one rainy night, they came. I heard them first, the sounds of their inhuman cries echoing through the woods. They emerged from the trees, their eyes glowing in the darkness, claws glinting in the moonlight. They were more numerous than I had imagined, a horde of nightmares come to life. I met them head-on, my guns blazing, my knives flashing. The night erupted in a cacophony of gunfire, roars, and screams. I fought with a ferocity born of desperation, each kill fueling my rage. They were relentless, their attacks coming from all sides. I felt their claws tearing at my flesh, their teeth gnashing at my bones. But I refused to give in. I would fight until my last breath, until every last one of them was dead. The battle raged for hours, the night sky lit by the flashes of gunfire and the eerie glow of the creature's eye. I was wounded, exhausted, but I kept fighting. Then, as the first rays of dawn began to break through the clouds, I saw him. He was larger than the others, his body a mass of muscle and sinew. His eyes burned with an intelligence that chilled me to the core. He was their leader, the alpha of the pack. He charged at me, his claws outstretched, his teeth bared in a silent snarl. I raised my gun, my finger tightening on the trigger. The shot echoed through the night, deafening roar that seemed to shake the very tree. The bullet found its mark, tearing through the creature's skull. It stumbled back, its body convulsing, and crashed to the ground, lifeless. A silence descended, broken only by the ragged gasps of my breath and the distant cries of retreating creatures. The battle was over. I had survived, but at what cost? My farm was a battlefield, littered with the bodies of the creatures and the spent casings of my weapon. I was wounded, my body a mass of cuts and bruises. My clothes were soaked in blood, my own and theirs. I collapsed onto the ground, my strength finally giving out. I lay there for what seemed like an eternity, staring up at the star-filled sky. A sense of despair washed over me. I had won the battle. The war was far from over. As the sun began to rise, casting its pale light over the carnage, I heard the distant sound of siren. Help was on the way. The next few days were a blur of activity. Police, paramedics, and news crews swarmed my farm. I was questioned, examined, and treated for my wounds. My story was met with disbelief at first. Evidence was undeniable. Bodies of the creatures, grotesque forms unlike anything ever seen before, spoke for themselves. News of the incident spread like wildfire. My farm became ground zero for a media frenzy. Scientists, cryptozoologists, and government officials descended upon the scene, eager to examine the creatures and unravel the mystery of their origin. I became an overnight celebrity. My story splashed across newspapers and television screens. I was hailed as a hero, a lone warrior who had saved the world from a terrifying threat. But I didn't feel like a hero. Felt like a broken man, haunted by the memories. That night, I couldn't shake the feeling that I had only won a temporary defeat. There were more of them out there somewhere, waiting for their chance to strike. In the aftermath of the attack, my farm became a research site. Scientists dissected the creatures, analyzed their DNA, and searched for clues to their origin. They found that the creatures were unlike any known species. Their biology a bizarre mix of reptilian and mammalian traits. Their origins remained a mystery, a riddle that defied explanation. As the investigation continued, I began to receive threats. Anonymous letters and phone calls filled with hate and accusation. Some people believed that I was responsible for the creatures, that I had somehow created them or unleashed them upon the world. Others accused me of being a government agent, part of a vast conspiracy to control the population through fear. I ignored the threats, but they took their toll. I became withdrawn, paranoid, couldn't sleep, couldn't eat. I was haunted by nightmares, visions of the creatures returning, their claws tearing at my flesh, their teeth gnashing at my bones. One day, as I was walking through the woods near my farm, I came across a group of men. They were dressed in camouflage, heavily armed. They surrounded me, their faces grim. "You Bamus Verer?" one of them asked. I nodded. "We're here to take you in," he said. "You're under arrest." "Arrest?" I said. "For what?" "For the murder of those people on your farm," said. "Those creatures you claim attacked you." I tried to explain, to tell them the truth, but they wouldn't listen. They dragged me away, their guns pointed at my back. I was thrown into a cell, my pleas for help ignored. I was charged with multiple counts of murder, accused of fabricating the story of the creatures to cover up my crimes. Trial was a media circus. The prosecution painted me as a cold-blooded killer, a monster who had slaughtered innocent people in cold blood. The defense argued that I was a victim, a man who had been driven to violence by the creatures that had invaded his farm. The jury deliberated for days, their faces etched with doubt and confusion. Finally, they returned with a verdict: not guilty. I was free, but the damage had been done. My life was in ruin. My farm was abandoned. My reputation was destroyed. I was a pariah, a man who had seen too much, who knew too much. I left town, disappearing into the anonymity of the city. I took odd jobs, living a life of solitude and obscurity, and I waited. I waited for the day when the creatures would return. I knew they would. They always did. When they did, I would be ready. The old man at the bar, his face weathered like a map of forgotten roads, leaned closer, his voice a low rasp. They called them the skulkers, he said. Those things. Always been stories, whispers in the dark, old Indian legends, tales of shadow creatures that stalk the night, feeding on the blood of the living. Skulkers. Fitting name for the creatures that had haunted my dreams, that had taken everything from me. Folks call me Ellis Cooper. I spent my younger days running with a rough crowd in Boston. That life ain't for everyone. I found myself drawn to the quiet, a craving for some peace and fresh air. So I traded the city streets for a secluded cabin in the Adara. It was 1980. Reagan was elected, John Lennon was shot, and Mount St. Helens blew her top. I watched it all on my black and white Zenith TV, the signal fuzzy but the news clear. The world felt far away, and that's how I liked it. Days were filled with chopping wood, fishing for trout in the nearby stream, and the occasional visit from Joe, my nearest neighbor, a half-mile trek through the woods. Then, things started getting strange. Joe went missing. One day he was grumbling about the rising price of gasoline, the next he was gone without a trace. I didn't think much of it at first, figuring he'd gone into town for supplies. But a week passed, then two, and still no sign of him. His dog, a mangy mutt named Buster, showed up at my doorstep, whimpering and looking starved. I took him in, but unease settled in my gut. The nights grew longer, filled with the rustle of leaves and the snap of twigs. Shadows danced on the walls, cast by the flickering flames in my fireplace, taking on shapes that sent shivers down my spine. Then came the smell, a sickly sweet stench that clung to the air like a shroud. It was the smell of decay, death, and it seemed to emanate from the woods. One night, a sound pierced the silence. A scream that cut through the darkness like a blade. It was a woman's scream, filled with terror and pain. I grabbed my old Winchester, a relic from my grandfather, and cautiously made my way towards the sound. The moonlight filtered through the trees, casting an eerie glow on the forest floor. I found her lying there, barely recognizable. It was Sarah, a young hiker who'd passed by a few days earlier. Her body was mangled, torn apart as if by some wild animal, but the wounds were too precise, too clean. This wasn't the work of any bear or mountain lion. Cold dread washed over me. I'd heard the old tales, the whispers of a creature that roamed these woods, being that wasn't quite human, not quite animal. They called it the Rend, a shadow in the moonlight, a predator that feasted on flesh and bone. I raced back to my cabin, barricading the door, heart pounding in my chest. I loaded the Winchester and kept vigil by the window, the darkness pressing against the glass like a living thing. The night stretched on, each creak of the house a hammer blow to my nerves. At dawn, I ventured out. The rising sun cast long shadows that seemed to twist and writhe. I found prints in the mud, large, elongated tracks that didn't belong to any creature I'd ever seen. They led towards the dense undergrowth, disappearing into the heart of the forest. We stood there for a long moment, the only sound the rushing of the river and the hammering of my heart. Then, with a guttural snarl that seemed to come from the depths of its being, the creature lunged. I stumbled back, tripping over a root and falling hard. The creature was on me in an instant, its weight crushing the air from my lungs. I felt its claws rake across my face, hot pain searing through me. I bucked and thrashed, my fists connecting with something hard and bony. The creature shrieked, a high-pitched, piercing sound that echoed through the trees. Reared back, giving me a precious moment to scramble away. I scrambled to my feet, my vision blurry with pain and adrenaline. The creature was still there, watching me, its eyes burning with a malevolent intensity. I backed away slowly, never taking my eyes off it. I stumbled back to the ranger station, my face a bloody mess, clothes torn. I told them everything, showed them the claw marks, the bloodstains on my clothes. This time, they listened. They had to. The evidence was right there on my face. They sent out a search party, armed and cautious. They found the remains by the riverbank, gruesome testament to the creature's savagery. The remains of the young couple were never found. The search for the creature continues. So far, it has eluded capture. It's out there somewhere in the vast wilderness of the Gila, a nightmare made flesh, a predator that walks on two legs, driven by an insatiable hunger that we can barely comprehend. They say they've found footprints, strange three-toed prints unlike anything they've ever seen. They say they've heard it at night. High-pitched keening sound that sends shivers down the spine. I'm no longer a ranger. The attack left me scarred both physically and mentally. But I can't shake the feeling that it's not over. Somewhere out there in the dark heart of the Gila, that creature is waiting, watching, and one day it will hunt again. The wren had come, and it had taken Sarah. But why? What did it want? These questions haunted me as I packed my belongings, knowing I couldn't stay here. This wasn't just a threat, it was a death sentence. I left a note for the authorities on Joe's door, plea for them to investigate Sarah's death. Then, with Buster at my heels, I set off down the mountain, leaving behind the cabin that had been my sanctuary, now tainted by the horrors of the night. I spent the next few days in a cheap motel in the nearest town, haunted by nightmares of the wren's glowing eyes and Sarah's screams. The news was filled with the Iran hostage crisis and the miracle on ice, but my mind was consumed by the darkness lurking in the woods. Police never found Joe. His disappearance, along with Sarah's gruesome death, was attributed to a rogue bear, a convenient explanation that ignored the chilling truth. As for me, I drifted from town to town, haunted by the memory of the wren, unable to find peace. Years passed, the world changed, the Berlin Wall fell, the internet became a thing, and I grew older, the lines on my face a map of the horrors I'd witnessed. But the Adara, those ancient mountains shrouded in mystery, never left my thoughts. One day a newspaper article caught my eye. A young couple had gone missing while hiking in the same area where I'd encountered the wren. The article mentioned strange tracks, foul odor, and a chilling scream heard in the night. Bold dread settled over me, familiar feeling I'd hoped never to experience again. I knew then that the wren was still out there, preying on the unsuspecting, its hunger insatiable. The thought of it returning to my old cabin, to the woods that had once been my haven, filled me with a rage I hadn't felt in years. I returned to the Adara, ghost from the past, drawn back to the place of my nightmares. The cabin stood as I'd left it, weathered and worn but still standing. The woods, however, seemed darker, more menacing. The silence was broken only by the mournful hoot of an owl. I waited, armed with my Winchester, and a heart hardened by grief, anger. Night after night, I patrolled the perimeter of my property, my eyes scanning the shadows, my ears straining for any sound. One moonless night, as the wind whispered through the trees, I heard it. A rustle of leaves, a snapping twig, the unmistakable sound of something moving through the undergrowth. I raised my rifle, my finger tightening on the trigger. A figure emerged from the darkness, its silhouette barely visible against the night sky. It was the wren, its elongated limbs and grotesque head silhouetted against the moon. It moved with a swiftness that defied its size, its glowing eyes fixed on me. This time, I wouldn't run. I wouldn't cower in fear. I raised the Winchester and fired. the shot echoing through the silent woods. Creature staggered, a guttural growl escaping its throat. I fired again and again, each shot a punctuation mark in the symphony of violence. The rend lunged, its claws outstretched, but I was ready. I dodged its attack and plunged my hunting knife into its chest, the blade sinking deep into its flesh. Creature let out a blood-curdling shriek, its body convulsing before collapsing onto the forest floor. I stood over the fallen beast, the stench of its blood filling my nostrils. It was over. The rend was dead. Its reign of terror finally ended. I had avenged Sarah, Joe, and all the others who had fallen prey to this abomination. But the victory was hollow. The woods were still silent, shadows still long. The rend was gone, but the fear remained, constant reminder of the darkness that lurked beneath the surface of this seemingly peaceful world. I left the Adara that day, the weight of the past heavy on my shoulders. I never returned.